All right, as we get going, y'all have an exam on Thursday. This is Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. I'll go ahead and start with some terms up here, and then we will gravitate around into a number of the articles. And I've got a couple of the articles that I've got to add in, so bear with me on that. What I wanted to stress to you is the review session will be a good start to get you prepared for this, but make sure that you're comfortable with the terms. Oftentimes the terms will turn into, multiple choice questions. The articles, some of them are going to be tailor-made for multiple choices because we had some quickies at different points, but what you'll also see in there is that some of them we spent a good amount of time on, and those are ones that will be more conducive to short answer. So this is going to be a little bit, if you've had me before, it's going to be a little bit of an article-heavy exam. So keep that in mind. Don't just focus on the chapter. If anything, focusing on the chapter could lead you astray, especially if it's at the expense of the articles. But just starting off with the terms, and let's just take it in order. From Chapter 1, do y'all have any questions about anything from Chapter 1?
McCulloch versus Maryland.
Anybody remember McCulloch versus Maryland? Go ahead.
It was a bank in Maryland. It was a federal bank in Maryland. What happened was Maryland did not want a federal bank, so what they did was they imposed a tax on all out-of-state banks. McCulloch was the teller, and he refused to pay the tax. It went to the Supreme Court, and it said that the Supreme Court ruled that states can't tax the federal government.
It was a supremacy clause case, ultimately, is what it boiled down to. And so you had the state government, and they were taxing, specifically, Gary, to destroy the federal bank. I mean, the deposit level, the taxes on those deposits, the taxes were higher depending upon the level of the deposit, but it was really way worse than even like the equivalent of ATM fees today. It was going to kill the national bank. And the United States Supreme Court said, does the federal government have the power to establish this bank? Is this within the scope of its powers? And they said yes. Ultimately, they dealt with the taxation issue, and they said the state is trying to tax or destroy something that is within federal power. And no, they can't do that. That is a violation of the idea that the federal Constitution and federal government powers cannot be stopped by state powers. So keep that one in mind. And then, of course, this is where it gets into federalism, the idea that you've got a federal government and a state government. Who wins ultimately when there's a disagreement? Well, when it's a federal power in the federal Constitution, the federal government is supposed to be the one that wins. So keep that thought in mind. Anything else that y'all got as far as terms? Just taking a look at this. And a number of these we hit really, really quick. Like, go ahead.
As far as the extradition clause, are you talking about the interstate compact that would, if Dustin's wanted in North Carolina and he's caught here, that they will extradite him? They have that agreement between states that we will extradite people wanted in your
It could
state.
be that. It really falls more within the full faith and credit clause. This would be an example of something that one state would recognize that would be a valid, say, outstanding warrant from another state, and they would have to send them back ultimately for Dustin's fate to be decided. Dustin, I suspect you're going to have some really interesting questions on the exam. I just have that feeling. A lot of these are quickies. When we talked about the commerce power, when commerce crosses state lines, the federal government controls it. However, so if it's interstate commerce, however, if it's intrastate commerce, meaning that it is commerce that only takes place within the context of one state, then states are the ones that control that. So I used to live around Brunswick. They grow a lot of corn around there. If the corn in Brunswick ultimately gets sold in Rockville, well, it never left the state, so that means Maryland could ultimately deal with that. Brunswick is fairly close to West Virginia. If they sent some of that corn to West Virginia, even though it's not much further than sending it to Rockville, because it crosses state lines, it means that the federal government could regulate. So that's what we're talking about there. And I may have mentioned to you that the commerce power is where the federal government gets an awful lot of power. You've even brought it up today, talking about segregation and discrimination kinds of issues. Anything else that y'all have up here? Go ahead.
Yeah, so you say number and stats from the outline. I'm looking at the chapter 2 outline, and there are a couple things on here like code 40 to 41, code 42.
Yeah, this is where we started to get into, I believe, for lack of a better word, 1,500 facials. And you'll notice, and that's going to be on the exam somewhere too, but you notice down here, and this is really where we started getting into it. This was at the very bottom of page 40, and then also continuing onto the top of page 41. And you'll notice down here, and bear with me, it says another type of interest group, blah, 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 blah. States, licensed barbers, beauticians, architects, lawyers, doctors, and it continues over teachers, accountants, dentists, and many other occupational groups. And this was where we had that series of articles, if you remember, that dealt with the training for police officers, the training for estheticians, the 1,500 facials, I believe, is where this came in. So you get the idea how different states could do this. So keep that in mind, and that's what we were talking about. Now, in this chapter, I think I had given you some other stats and numbers too. And I believe that this was closer to the very beginning. Yeah, here we go. And you'll notice up here, and this is actually from page 34, where we have been talking about blah, 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 blah. Maybe it's not this one so much as it's 35. But you'll notice up here, state and local governments, and I'll zoom in just a skosh. More than 89,000 state and local governments spend slightly more than $2 trillion, which is 14% of U.S. GDP. You'll notice down here that is less than the federal government's expenditures of nearly $3 trillion, in 2008, which were approximately 21%. So you notice on this, and then it starts getting into these state and local governments employ more than 19 million people, 7 times more than the 2.7 million civilians the federal government employs. And then it goes down and it breaks down to education, hospitals, police, and corrections, and different things like this. So I don't necessarily do a lot with numbers, and I'm not necessarily going to say, well, how many people work in police protection kind of a thing, but take a look at these numbers a little bit, because I'm sure there's going to be a question in there somewhere. And then going back to the articles, and I'll hit on this right quick too. This was chapter 2, and going back to the articles, my bad, I went in the wrong direction. Going back and looking at chapter 2 in here, chapter 2 in here, chapter 2 in here, and it says the articles, and if you remember, I think this was the talking deodorizer article is what it was. And we had talked about California's prisons, we had talked about the TV commercials getting people to go ultimately to Tennessee, and then here you go. The article that we were talking about, in North Carolina, the training to be a police officer was 360 hours. However, to be a 1,500 hours to be a licensed barber, you get the idea. Actually, it was Louisiana that was just 360. North Carolina, 600. Manicurists needed more training than police officers in Louisiana. So take a good look at those. Those might be some numbers that would be of some relevance. And then, of course, scrolling down here, the public urination. I don't think we talked about the public urination, but I know we talked about the talking deodorizers. You remember what the talking deodorizers were?
Hey, big boy.
Hey, big guy. Yeah, you get the oh my God, this is on camera. You get the idea, but there were 3 or 4 of these. And let me stress to you, if there's an article that's on the page that we didn't talk about, don't worry about it. But just because these things are really small, and just again, to put them into scale, they're not that big, but oftentimes they do have some specific pieces in there. So kind of keep those in mind. Just looking, since we're in chapter 2, y'all remember the city manager?
Yes, had a sex change operation.
Yeah, and what was that the controversy?
The controversy was that he or she would announced it using a press conference.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was in small town Florida. Y'all remember the city because it escapes me. Largo, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Largo. You notice up here, this was Steve Stanton. And if you remember on this, he had actually made an announcement in his capacity as city manager and held a press conference that he was going to have a sex change operation. Do you remember what ultimately ended up happening with this, what the controversy was?
He was
Wasn't it called unrest in the community?
Yeah, yeah.
Loss of faith.
If you go back on this, yeah, that's a pretty good one on this. They had public hearings on this, and effectively, when they were having these public hearings on this, there were a lot of people that came out and said an awful lot of pieces on this. but you'll notice, but others said Stanton bullied city employees, and the publicity generated by his announcement cast the city in a negative light. You even got the word up here that says laughing stock kind of a thing. Stanton, was he allowed to keep his job?
No.
No, and you'll notice there it is. After this hearing, it was a 5-2 vote ultimately that they said. And you're right on this. When you go back and you look at this, let's be honest. I mean, on its face, they gave an awful lot of reasons why it wasn't about him getting this operation. They lost confidence in him and the disruption caused by his announcement, not because he wants to be a woman. But the fact is that, this was about 10 or 15 years ago. That probably has more sway in this than we would really think. So they didn't call it out for that. But, and you notice down here at the end, it says his contract says he can be fired without cause at any time. So technically speaking, they kind of had him as long as they could justify this with the right reasons, if you will. But yeah, it was legal to fire him, and he did not get his job back. Looking at a couple of the other ones on here, and I know that your time is valuable. Y'all remember the foul ball?
Yeah.
What was the foul ball?
Woman was at a baseball game and a foul ball hit her in the face.
Yeah, and they estimated that foul ball was going like over 90 miles an hour. And do you remember exactly what had happened with the context of that ball?
Yeah. It hit her in the face and she had to get like 9 plates or something put in. 8 or 9.
It was really, really bad on this. And you notice up here, golly, where is it? It says up here, she sued the team for $486,909 in lost wages and medical expenses and 8 plates in her face, as you said on this. And it was traveling about 90 miles an hour when it hit her. But it says up here, the Red Sox had no duty to warn the plaintiff of the obvious danger of a foul ball being hit into the stands. And you remember the other thing that I had showed you in the context of this that gave some of you? The back of the ticket, the fine print, actually says that you assume any risk by going to a baseball game, going to a football game, these kinds of things. So if you do get hit with a ball or a puck or a helmet, or, I don't know, if you go to soccer, somebody taking off their shirt after they score and the shirt hits you in the, I don't know, I don't pay attention to soccer. But it's just the idea that, you would be assuming the risk and you're not going to win off of this because you agreed to the terms when you used the ticket, even if you didn't read the back of the ticket or the fine print on what you printed out. Going a little bit further on this, the porn police. Do y'all remember the porn police?
Yeah.
Anybody?
Oh,
That's
there's
when the agents.
Homeland
Homeland
Security.
Security.
Homeland Security. And where was this?
Maryland.
Right here in Maryland.
Montgomery County. I believe it was Bethesda, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I believe it was Bethesda is where this was. And yeah, Bethesda. And you'll notice in there, this is talking about the viewing of internet porn basically in the public library. So these guys, and this is really almost comical, they walked in with hats that said Homeland Security. They were unarmed guys. They were patrolling buildings in the aftermath of 9/11, and ultimately they asked people in a very loud voice, they demanded them, in fact, to stop looking at the porn. So when you look at this, they made this announcement, and then the librarians got involved. And so are you allowed to view porn in the public library?
Yes.
Yeah, and we got to admit this. Catherine is the one that just shakes her head, so she's not going to be on camera with this. But yeah, it is technically legal. And you'll notice in here, it says, but in a library which is both a public arena and a county workplace, the U.S. Constitution trumps Montgomery's rules. So maybe there could be sexual harassment, but they said, no. This is a library, this is a First Amendment issue, and this is an expression piece. Look this over, and you'll notice in here, the biggest problem with these officers was the idea that, hey, I mean, these are unarmed folks, they're supposed to be doing Homeland Security. The porn maybe you shouldn't be looking at it in the library, but the fact is that this was not part of their job description. So ultimately, they were reassigned other duties. There might be one more article that I've got to add from here, and I'll go back and I'll double check.